In red ink. It's no secret that government has gotten too big in size and scope in order to work effectively. So what if it were run more like your household? My next guest says not only is that possible, but government would run a lot better if it was run the way you run your house. Economist Robert Murphy from the Mises Institute joins us now. Robert, it's a pleasure. As always, welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Thanks for having me back, Judge.
What should the government do differently than it does now? And how should the government work that would make it more like you run your house and I run mine and almost everybody watching us now runs theirs?
Well, what have the American people done? Everybody said the problem with the housing bubble years was people were living beyond their means. So what did the American public do? They increased their savings rate, right? You can see that in the statistics. It jumped way up. They started paying down their debt. That's exactly what you're supposed to do. Instead, what did Washington do? They said, oh my gosh, people are saving more. We have to counteract that. We need to borrow more than we've ever borrowed before. So, I mean, that's one thing right there. Another issue is if you're deep in debt and you don't want to go deeper into debt, what can you do? You can slash your spending and you can sell off assets. And this whole discussion about the debt ceiling, very few people are saying, look, at the federal government has literally over $1 trillion in liquid assets they could start selling to get us through this crunch. For example, the federal government has over $400 billion in student loans. So when Treasury Secretary Geithner says, oh, we don't have the money, we need to borrow more, we're going to default, he's just making that up. They have plenty of assets they could liquidate.
Well, why is it that you think the government would not liquidate its assets? I mean, with the exception of a couple of years during the Civil War, we didn't have an income tax in this country until 1915, 16, 17, in that era, and it wasn't for another 20 or 30 years that it was a meaningful income tax, meaning it took a lot of money from people. So for the first 150 years of the government's existence, it operated on revenues for services that it provided to people and to the states and on the sale of federal property. What is it about federal property, whether it's real estate or whether it's an obligation that somebody owes the federal government, that the feds just don't want to give it up?
Well, you know, it's funny. It's almost comical to read. There was a Wall Street Journal article recently talking about the debt ceiling, and it was listing bullet points, you know, to explain myths and misconceptions. And one of the points was saying, why don't they just sell off assets? And it listed not only the student loans, but the government claims it has millions of ounces of gold, like $400 billion worth. So the article said, why don't they just sell that? And the official response from the White House was that, well, we wouldn't want to disrupt the financial markets. You know, so that's the reason. So we need to borrow more and so forth. We have no choice because we don't want to disrupt the market. So that's the official reason. I think the real reason, of course, is they think we don't need to. Why would we give up this property? Because, you know, for their point of view, they like owning that stuff.
When the government borrows money and then borrows more money in order to pay back the money that it originally borrowed, does that send a signal to the American public to stop saving and to live the way the government does? Stated differently, will the government's terrible management of its own finances actually accelerate the demise and the bankruptcy of hardworking Americans?
Well, I think it does, and you're right, it does have this corroding influence. I mean, just remember back when the TARP package first went through, I mean, late-night comedians, everybody was making jokes about, hey, when do I get my bailout, you know, and then even on the talk radio and so forth, the commercials for refinancing your mortgage and stuff, everyone was saying, get your own bailout. And I think it's not healthy for the economy when it becomes a public joke that if you get in trouble and get over your head, you just get bailed out by the taxpayer. That's not a healthy thing. So you're right. I mean, people, if we went back to a system where there was sound money and the government paid its bills and lived within its means, I think that not only would that be good in and of itself, but it would be a good precedent, and it would keep other people more responsible to know that that's just the way you're supposed to run things.
Robert Murphy, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Back with the plain truth.